Okay, let us start. Hello. Hello. Okay, it's Friday, 5 p.m. Let's not pretend that we're all happy being here. But we shall talk about the dissertation, which is a very exciting topic. My name is Rafa Zaborowski, and I am the convener of the dissertation course. And I will be with you this and next term in the various workshops and lectures connected to your dissertation. I am hoping you all know you have to produce a dissertation by the end of the academic year. How many of you?
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Yes, I will try to speak louder. How many of you have written a dissertation before? Okay, good. How many of you know what they want to write about in their dissertation this year? Roughly. Very roughly. Okay, 3 people. Okay, that's a good place to be, I think. Yeah. So, we will talk about this today. I won't go into many details today because we only have an hour. It's our first session, and we'll have many sessions that deal with very specific things, how to write a literature review, how to employ a certain method, how to deal with ethical clearance. So we'll have time to do this. Today is a more general view what a dissertation is and what are its elements and how to go about starting thinking about the different topics that you might want to explore. So this is what we'll do today. We will talk about what a dissertation is. I'll show you an example timeline of where you should be at each stage. I'll also give you some dates in which important things happen for your dissertation. And then we'll try to think together about research questions and topics and some practical tips of how to organize it all in the next 11 months till September 10. So what is a dissertation? I'm sure you know what a dissertation is roughly, but just to break it down into elements. A dissertation is a piece of writing, you know that. You cannot perform a dissertation, unfortunately, in this department. You have to write it. So it's a piece of writing that is quite long. Right? It's longer than your essays. I know, that's simple. Don't worry. It'll get more complicated. It's between 10,000 and 15,000 words, depending on your program and depending on various things I will cover later. But it is quite long. It's not quite a book, and it's not quite an essay. It's somewhere in between. So it's a long written piece that is based on extended reading. Right? So it's not free writing. First, you read a lot. You identify debates. You identify theory. And then you write. So it's a long piece of writing based on reading that is structured. Right? That's the last element, perhaps. Right? So again, it's not just 10,000, 15,000 of words written as you wish, but it's broken down into specific sections, right, that deal with different things. I will tell you about these sections in a second. So what does a dissertation do? Perhaps the most important thing that it does is that it answers a question. That's it. You need to answer a question. In order to answer a question, you first need to ask the question. So your dissertation is a clear line of thought, is a clear line of argument that you develop to answer a certain central question. Right? This is what's important in your dissertation. Your dissertation will be based on original research. And by original, I don't mean it has to be research that no one has ever done before, because that might not be possible. But what I mean by original is that the research will be done by yourself. You have to do something original in your thesis. You have to gather data. you have to compare literature, right? So yes, you'll be basing it on books and different theories, but you will have your own original contribution. So on the one hand, you will show the knowledge of the subject, you will show that you know your facts, you know your field, you know the key debates in your field, but you will also find out something new and relevant. Now, when I said that this is a long piece, it's actually not that long. It's not long enough for you to do something truly groundbreaking, probably, although some of you might, and we should all try. But what I mean by something new and relevant could be something small. It could be applying an old theory to a new field, right? Or looking at a study that looks at certain population, but it hasn't been tested in a different population. So it could be something new, but we could scale this expectation. And when I say it's something relevant, it's relevant to you, of course, but also for other people. Right? So it could be relevant for academia, it could be relevant for industry, it could be relevant to everyday people. Doesn't matter. You tell us who is it relevant for. So, with that in mind, that's roughly what a dissertation is. How do you get there between now and your submission? What happens in each of these stages? Again, roughly, and no exact dates, just to be quite general about it for a second, because every more specific info will be in the kids in the coming weeks. But the first stage you need to do will come in early February 2019, where you will submit a dissertation abstract. It's not a long piece of writing. It will be basically a paragraph, 300 words, a question, a number of example literature points, but that's really it. You will submit a dissertation abstract in February. Based on that, you will be assigned a dissertation supervisor in February. Your dissertation supervisor would be the person who you work with between February and July on your dissertation. You will meet them, you will send them your writing, and you will discuss and get advice. In April, or around April, you will be advised to send your supervisor a rough outline of your dissertation, 1 page maybe, just what chapters will be there roughly. It doesn't have to be 100% your real outline, but just showing that you're starting to think about this. And draft chapters of literature review and methodology. I advise you all to do that, because if you do that, you get feedback from your supervisor, which will happen around May and June, depending on when you send it to your supervisor and what are they doing in the meantime. Another deadline to keep in mind will be early June, which is the time you need to get your ethics clearance. We'll have a session on that, so I don't want to worry you too much, but this is something you need to go through if your research is risky, or if you're involving human participants. The school, King's College, and the department needs to make sure that everything is ethical and there is no possibility of harm coming either to you or to your participants. So this is a piece of paper that you write, you outline your research, you submit to your supervisor, they put it on a school server. It goes through a process. It's not very complicated, it's very straightforward, but the date is important. You need to get it done by early June. Then, from July on, you will be working independently on your dissertation. Right? So you can meet your supervisor till the end of June, and then after the end of June, there will be only light supervision. That means you can email your supervisor, they might respond, but these will be light queries such as formatting, such as procedural issues. This is not the time to ask your supervisor, do I need to interview 15 more people? Is this argument okay? Do I need to read this book? Right? These are the questions that need to be sorted out before the end of June. And then in September you submit a dissertation, and that's it, and you live happily ever after. Now, in more tangible terms what you should be doing in all this time. Between now and February, so you have November, December, January, you should be reading and discussing. You should be continuing to do whatever it is you're doing for your classes, which should be reading, discussing, thinking about concepts, thinking about research. And in the back of your head, keep in mind what is interesting about it, what could make a good dissertation, what interests you in this data. Right? So while you do all your coursework, think about what drives you about this topic, what you would like to explore further. And once you find it, whenever you read something and you think, well, this would fit my dissertation, you write it down. You keep a special file, dissertation ideas. Right? So once you identify a topic, you will start finding traces of your topic in different places. You will start to find theories that might fit. You will start to see reports about this topic. And you're starting to see, hopefully, some gaps. You're starting to see, well, this topic has been identified in this way and this way, but actually nobody has ever approached it in this way. Interesting. Maybe I should do it. So this is the time for you, till February, to think about your topic, think about the literature, think about the questions that haven't been asked yet. Then, with your supervisor and on your own between March and June, you will be perhaps getting more into the dissertation itself. So you'll be seeing your supervisor, you'll be writing your literature review, you will be changing your research question, you will be maybe rephrasing it, you will be approaching it from a different angle. You will be planning and preparing for data collection. You will need to collect some data for your dissertation. If your dissertation is empirical, then the data is straightforward. This would be interviews, or this would be surveys, or this would be archives, right? But this all would be data. Right? If your dissertation is more theoretical, without empirical component, you will still collect data. Right? You will collect literature, you will collect some data to apply it in a different context. Right? So this is something that might take some time, which is why you need some planning. And you will be also drafting literature review and research design chapters, as we said, to show your supervisor. June and July, usually, and again, this is just an example, different dissertation, different types of project will follow different timelines, but roughly, this is where you will gather data. You will start analyzing the data, and you will hopefully see some patterns. You will see something interesting in your data. You will start to form your arguments. And then July, August will be when you will be really writing it up. The important thing is to leave enough time for writing. Even if you're a quick writer, even if you can edit really fast, it will still take a lot of time. Writing is not a linear process. You will write in chunks. You will not start with chapter 1 and finish with chapter 8. You will write different things. You will be revising theory as you find something new in your findings. You'll be revising the methodology when you remind yourself that you did something else, right? So it will all be much more messy and chaotic than you think now. Okay, so what makes a good dissertation? Very much like a good journal article. You've read a number of research articles by now for your classes. Some of them were good, some of them maybe you didn't like as much. Why is that? Because a good dissertation, good journal article, on the one hand shows an intellectual grasp of the topic and relevant scholarly debate. So what it shows that you know your stuff. It shows that, yes, you've chosen this topic, and you know what's going on in this topic. You know the relevant people in this topic. You know the relevant theories. You know the recent research, but you can also, also the theories from the past that are relevant to this research, right? So it's showing that, yes, you know the different angles that people have researched this. But also, a good dissertation is something that has a narrative, that has a thread throughout it, that is all connected. It's not just a collection of chapters, It all should make sense together. So when you say, I chose this topic for this reason, it has to link to why you have asked a certain question. And depending on what question you ask, well, this links to a certain method, because certain questions can only be answered in certain methods. And because you use this method, you got certain results. It's all connected. It's not separate. And your writing should be clearly written, organized, and presented. It has to make sense. It has to make sense to a person who is not necessarily an expert in this very specific issue. This person reading your dissertation should see, okay, this is the topic, this is the question asked, this is what they did, this is their answer. Makes sense. And as you know from your essays by now, you need to reference your dissertation meticulously. Right? So any idea that is not yours needs to be acknowledged in the text and in the bibliography. Bibliographies are very long in dissertations, so it's good to have a head start already. Now these are some things you can find in a dissertation. Not all your dissertations will have all of these elements, right? Because your dissertation might, for example, not need tables or figures. So you will not have a table of figures. But all of your dissertation will have a cover sheet, will have a title page, will have an abstract. You might want acknowledgements to thank your mother, and so on, but you don't have to. You do need to have a table of contents to organize your content clearly. You need to have introduction, you need to have some background about why this study is important. You need to have some sort of theory section, some sort of research design, and then the meat, the interesting stuff, the analysis, what you found out, why is this relevant. You need to not end abruptly, you need to have a conclusion that tells us why is this relevant, how does it advance the debate, why is it helpful for anyone that you did that. And then, and again something we will discuss later in the term, probably most, if not all of your dissertation will have appendices where you would include additional information, such as raw data, for example. If you're doing interview study, this would be interview transcript. If you're doing some sort of data analysis, this would be the corpus of the data, or an example, or a coding range. Right? So it could be a number of things. But generally, as a rule, it could be anything that is not part of the main argument, but helps the reader understand your data more. So this is an abstract that you will need to complete by February. It will be a rough abstract. It will not be a final abstract. You will rewrite your abstract many times. Abstracts are very difficult to write, as you might know, because you've written one, I'm sure. Because abstract is a mini dissertation. It has to have everything in it. It has to introduce the topic. It has to tell us why this topic is relevant in the second sentence. Then it has to show us what are the theories in this topic. So let's say 3 and 4. And then tell us what you did and why is this relevant. Right? So these are 7 very heavy sentences that need to be written beautifully and make sense to everyone. Right? So writing abstract is very difficult. We'll probably have a workshop about that. But this is an indispensable part of a dissertation. Table of contents might look very different depending on how you want to organize it. The text can be hanging, it can be in bold, it can have different formatting. It doesn't really matter as long as it's organized in a clear way. Again, figure list, something you might want to have if you have figures, but if you don't have figures, clearly you will not have a figure list. But what I mean by figures is, well, if you're analyzing tweets, let's say, you might want to include some examples of these tweets, right? So we would then list them as figure. Figure 1, this tweet. Right? As figures, you might want to have images from press, like this one from the New Yorker, right? So again, you would call it figure number, and what is it, right? So everything that is not text that you will put there needs to be subtitled as figures or tables. It could be screenshots from software if that's helpful, right? So this is also a type of figure. Right? So your dissertation can be just plain text without any figures, but it might have figures. If you have figures, make sure they are clearly labeled. And bibliography. So we talked about bibliography. You have to have bibliography, a list of authors that you use throughout and mentioned in the text. So you need to have both in-text citation and overall bibliography. The bibliography is not books that you're really like and you're inspired by, but those ideas that you actually use, right? The ideas that you actually refer to. There's as you know, a style guide available on Keats, so you can stick to that. You should stick to the formatting system, referencing system. It will make life easier if you start already. So more broadly, you will have a title and an abstract, again something that is being rewritten until the very end. Your introduction will set the scene. It will provide some context. This might be personal context, why you are personally interested in the subject, but also a broader context. Why is this topic important? For whom? Right? For some people, for research, for academia, for certain companies, for the betterment of humankind, and so on and so on. Then you'll have some sort of theories section. When you compare the literature, you tell us which theories are important, and then you tell us what you actually did. What are the methods you used? What are the steps you took to get your results? You'll then analyze them and reach a conclusion. That's it? Yeah? So what do you need to do next? In February, this is what you will need to submit. You'll get emails about this, so don't worry. You don't need to take pictures. They'll all be online. This is just to give you a certain idea, long time in the future, in February, what you need to do. Student name, number, program, that's easy. Research question is the tricky part, and a 300-word abstract. So research question, a question that you think would be good to ask and then answer through your research. And then an abstract, 300 words that tell us what is this research, why is it important, what you will do, and why. And what do you think you'll find out, perhaps. Then we'll also ask you about example bibliography. So I'm talking here about, let's say, around 10 items, probably not more than that. We'll give you a specific number in a while, but it won't be more than 10 items, right? Just to show that you know very briefly the literature in your topic. And some keywords defining, describing your research in a big way. You will also be able to name a potential supervisor. You can do it by researching people in the department, looking who would be a good fit for the research you're planning to do. You might not be assigned a supervisor that you choose because of various things, because of workloads, because of, depending on how many people choose a potential supervisor, and also depending on the topic fit between you and the supervisor. So we will try to allocate you a supervisor as close to the topic as possible, and we'll try to respect your preference, but this might not be possible in some cases. So, what should you be doing now? I think three things, You should be thinking about your topic. You should be thinking about literature about your topic, surrounding your topic, and you should be slowly thinking about your research question. The last one is a tough part. A good research question is a difficult thing to craft. We'll spend 10 minutes on it today, but we will also keep talking about this throughout these workshops. So, the good thing is, the field is very wide. We have lots of areas to choose from. Digital humanities, humanities in general. This is an interdisciplinary field, and we have a whole range of topics to choose from. Some of you might be interested in data, some of you might be interested in humans that use that data. Some of you might want to do a quantitative study, some of you might want a qualitative study. You know? There's space for many projects within the range of our dissertations. So that's the good news. But it's also the bad news, because it's a huge topic and you need to narrow it down and specify by February. So maybe it's helpful if you think about what your dissertation could achieve. And I mentioned how, again, 10,000 words, 15,000 words, it's a lot, but it's not really a lot. So keep your expectations in check. We might not save the world through your dissertation, but we might find something interesting, relevant. These are the type of things that your dissertation might achieve, and these are some examples. It might achieve something else. But it might, for example, replicate a study that already exists, but in a different setting. Maybe there's a Western study, but it hasn't been tested in the global South. It can explore a new area, right? Something new. New digital phenomenon that hasn't been researched. Boom, good. It can extend a previous study. So there was a previous study, but we haven't really included these groups in this study. It could be more methodological. You could say, well, this topic is very important because we don't really have the right tools to investigate this phenomenon. How about we modify existing tools or find out new tools to explore this subject? Boom, that's good too. So this is a number of things that we could do through our dissertation. And we start by narrowing the topic. So let's say in a few weeks, hopefully you will have an idea, a kernel, that you will think, okay, this sounds potentially like something interesting. And it will probably be very wide. You will think about something like digital publishing, let's say. It's a good idea, it's just super wide. So the time spent between now and February, and even April probably, will be narrowing down the topic into something researchable, something that can be actually answered with your research. So I would like us to look at some examples of how we might do it. So I'll start with digital publishing. We have an idea, digital publishing. That's way too big. Why don't we narrow it down to a certain region? Digital publishing in the UK. That's better, but it's still too wide. Well, maybe digital publishing of academic research in the UK. That's better, but still too wide. Right? So at some point we will do it, we will manage with this, we will revise it, and we might end up with something like, why don't we look at open access publishing in the English market? Which is still quite wide, but we're getting close to an actual topic, to actual research question, right? This is something that is researchable. A completely different topic, fan fiction. Let's say you really like fan fiction. You're part of fan fiction community, or just reading, or writing. It doesn't matter, you want to do it. That's fine. But this is still too wide. So let's say, well actually, these are three completely different topics we can then narrow it down to. We could look at the people in the community and say, these people that write fan fiction and read fan fiction, they form imagined communities on the internet. These communities are highly hierarchized. Some people are more important than others based on their cultural capital. Interesting. Topic one, right? But maybe we're not interested in the people. We're interested in fan fiction itself. Let's look at the legal issues. Right? People who write fan fiction, how do they deal with the copyright issue? Right? What is the legal ground? What are the tensions between creativity on the one hand and intellectual property on the other? Right? So it could be maybe legal analysis plus some sort of textual analysis. And thirdly, maybe we're not interested in legal stuff, we're not interested in the community, but we're interested in the actual content of fan fiction. So let's pick a topic in a fan fiction of a certain genre, in country X, might end up with something like this, and just analyze fanfics and look at the trends. So we have one topic and 3 completely different dissertations with different methods and different theories, right? So getting from one to one of these will be what you do in the next weeks, months. Very briefly, some more examples. Digital voice synthesizers, just to show how wide this feels. So we had digital publishing, we had fan fiction, now voice synthesizers. Maybe we're interested in voice synthesizers, right? So you write something and then the computer sings back for you. Interesting. Maybe it revolutionizes music. How could we research it? Well, we could look at marketing of these voice synthesizers. Why do people buy them? Why do people sell them? That's interesting, maybe. One. Maybe we're interested in people that use them. In what ways amateur musicians are helped by these voice synthesizers? Maybe. Okay. Does it increase digital literacy in a certain way? Do people now know more about music than they knew before, thanks to those? Maybe. Or maybe we are interested, the third one, in the idea of authenticity, right? Music is all about authenticity, right? The fans like something because the music is real, authentic. But if you don't have voice, if the voice goes to the computer, that everybody sounds the same, don't you lose the authenticity then? I don't know. Let's ask the audience. Right? So let's ask the fans of music and ask what they think. Let's ask the musicians maybe. Right? So again, 3 very different subtopics of a very big topic. This is how I would like you to think about your topics in the next weeks. I'll skip this one, but we can do it with interactive museums if you're interested in archives. So we can do the same intellectual process about any topic of your interest. So then, what happens then? Let's say our topic is narrow enough. Now we need to think about the research question. What do we do? Again, let's look at some examples. So let's stick with digital publishing. We ended up doing the dissertation about digital publishing of academic research in the UK. What is the question we can ask? A question that will be answered with our research. There could be many. I just chose one. How has the transition of the digital publishing affected the dissemination of research in UK universities? Right? So in what ways the fact that we are now publishing digitally might or might not have affected dissemination of research in the university? Maybe interesting. Maybe interesting for academics, maybe interesting for other people, I'm not sure. How would we do it? Well, again, we could think about a number of ways to check, but one of the ways to conduct this dissertation would be to look at metrics of impact, right? So how digital publications in one institution and non-digital publication in a different institution, does it affect, does it correlate with how widely they are disseminated? Does the fact that research is now online makes more people read it or makes politicians act on it, right? We could do the same with digital voice synthesizers. I'll skip, but these slides will be online. We could do the same with, let's say, the role of women editors in Europe or historical research, right? So go through these examples whenever you're struggling with narrowing down your research and writing research questions. These are some examples of how to get from something very big to something manageable. But more than that, I would like to talk a little bit about what a research question is. Research question is very important. Research question is the meat of your dissertation. It's where you ask the important question. It needs to be a number of things. It needs to be specific, as we said. It needs to be narrowed down. Why? Well, because it needs to be manageable. It needs to be answerable. At the end of the dissertation, you need to actually explicitly come out and say, I've answered this question. This is the answer. Right? So it cannot be too general. It cannot be rhetorical. It couldn't be unanswerable. It cannot be too ambitious. It actually needs to be explicitly answered. It said, yes, I found out the answer to this question. It doesn't have to be a yes-no answer. In fact, that's probably a bad dissertation. But the answer could be, well, here are the 4 factors that complicate this issue and give us the answer of why things are the way they are. So specific, manageable, answerable. On the other hand, it needs to be interesting. It needs to be relevant to you, but also to other people. It needs to be relevant to the wider world. It needs to be non-obvious, meaning you need some work to answer this question. It shouldn't be answerable by just anyone, right? Because otherwise, why write a dissertation, right? So it needs to be challenging. You actually need to do some research to answer it, but it also needs to be manageable. That's the trick. So the value of your dissertation will actually, in many cases, be assessed in the way your research question is stated and then the way it is answered. It's very important. You will spend much time talking with your supervisor and your peers about your research question and about the type of answer you're giving. What should you be doing about your research question now? Not much. Think about this. Again, start thinking about what would be a good research question. You will rewrite your research question many times, but try to make it clear, try to make it interesting, and try to make it relatively new. Right? So finding the gaps, leading literature, it's all connected to finding the right research question. And then later, next term, you will be thinking about the deeper question about your research approach. So how your research question is contributing to the literature, the so what question. What is interesting about it for other people? You need to spell it out in your dissertation, as well. In what ways does the answering of your research question in what ways it creates implication for other things? It could be for industry, for academia, for companies, for peoples, for audiences, for viewers, and so on. So what are the consequences of you stating the question this way and answering it in a certain way? But that's later. Okay, research questions. Any questions? Okay. So I've mentioned you should be reading and thinking about stuff now. How exactly you should be doing that? Well, first of all, and we will have a session on literature review, so this is just very briefly. There will be different types of sources you will use in your dissertation. You will use different types of literature for different needs. You might want to use encyclopedias for definitions. You might want to use textbook and handbooks for explanations. You might want to use journal articles, and in fact, most of you will be, for more conceptual work, for methods, for case studies. But you will also probably use reports for some raw data and analysis, not necessarily in a scholarly way. And you will also, while you read the literature, you will engage in sort of citation analysis, meaning who's quoting who, right? You will read a lot of people, and you will see, well, these names keep popping up, right? They're clearly important people in the field. You will start to identify debates between those people, between different points of view. So what will be important in your literature review will be not taking the literature at face value, being critical about this, using your judgment to organize it in a way that suits your research question. Because it's impossible for you to review all the literature there is about your topic. You can't do that. And you don't want to do that. You want to only review the literature in a way that makes sense for your research question. Again, all of it has to be connected. Your literature review will say, these are the 3 ways people have written about this topic, A, B, and C. A agrees with B, C is sort of in the middle, but none of this perspective does this. Well, I will. Look at me doing. Boom. Right? So literature review will already serve a purpose of you setting yourself up to be brilliant later. So now, what you're doing, you're reading and you're noticing patterns. You're noticing who writes about what issues in which ways. You will hopefully be noticing that certain authors are in dialogue with other authors. You will find some arguments more convincing than others. This is all helpful. Take it down, note it, because it will disappear the less you think about this next term. So making maps of concepts and arguments is something you might be helpful. Identifying the relationship, identifying the gaps. This is something that looks a bit scary, but actually it's not, right? All it takes is to write down what you read and identifying, does it connect to my dissertation topic in any way? If so, how can I use this as an argument? Or how can I critique it? How can I compare it to something else? Some people find Graham's mind maps helpful to do that. It doesn't work for others, but some people find organizing it visually helpful. So this is how you might want to, again, if this works for you, identify different schools of thought and different arguments, right? So we have these people here, they're linked to these other people, this links to this idea of this person, but is at odds with this other school of thought, right? So again, something that could be a very rough draft of your literature review, identifying the debates. So practical suggestion is to read actively. I covered that. Make your notes electronically. Now, I am not dissing here the old pen and paper. That's all very good. The only advantage that electronic notes have is that they are searchable, right? So that might be helpful in organizing it. But you can do all these things non-electronically as well. What I would say is dose the reading to yourself, especially theoretical stuff, read in July frantically in the last weeks before submission. That's not a very good idea. It all becomes very blurry, all these concepts, all these theories. Right? So set daily quotas for reading, stick to them, don't read too much. It's better to read a journal article and have some notes, identify main argument properly, rather than skim through 10 and not note anything. What I would also advise is to start on your bibliography now. I've mentioned it in passing, but what I mean by that, if you take an argument, if you take an example or a quote, and you think it will be useful for you, take the whole reference already and put it down and write, this was Johnson 2012, page 15. This book, this title. Right? It will save you a lot of time in a few months. Your reference list will be massive. And organizing it at the end, formatting, making sure everything fits, this will take you a long, long time. Right? So it's fine if you use software to do that. There's a number of software packages, as you might know, Zotero, Mendeley, EndNote, they're all fine. But even if you do it in a Word file, just do it as you go, rather than in the last minute. Right, I've mentioned ethics clearance, and we will have a session on that. So again, very briefly, when you think about your subject, think about whether there is any concern, whether the research is ethical. Again, what does it mean that the research is ethical or not? We'll spend an hour on that, probably. But there are some certain things that might be caused by your research, whether you talk to real people, whether you ask them for their opinion or not. So some obvious types of harm that might result from your research are distress, sad memories, anxiety, right? You ask people about something traumatic, that might evoke some negative feelings or medical conditions, right? So these are some very obvious things. Anonymity, right? If you're revealing secret information, if you're identifying people in research who might get into trouble in their home countries when they will be quoted in your report, right? Sort of basic stuff. Are you putting anyone in harm? Emotional harm, physical harm. But some harm is less obvious, right? Let's say you're analyzing numbers, just data. You say, well, there's no ethical clearance here because I'm just doing data. But you might want to ask yourself a question, might your statistical findings contribute to a pattern of prejudice or discrimination, right? Right? Not necessarily disproves your research and makes it unresearchable, but in terms of self-reflexivity, thinking about the wider consequences of your research is always helpful. Right? Might you be stereotyping, describing this group of people? Would they agree with being described that way? Right? And so on and so on. So always good to keep in mind such reflexive questions. Lastly, the relation between you and supervisor. I mentioned you will have your supervisor assigned to you in February. What can you expect from them? You can expect 6 hours of consultation. You can expect during this consultation to talk about all sorts of things. About your topic, about questions. You can propose topics, right? You'll be in charge of these meetings. You will set the tone. You will tell your supervisor what you want to discuss with them. So it probably will be something about theories, about methodology, about procedures. You will clear the ethical forms with them. And last but not least, they will read your chapters, shall you submit it to them. So again, you have to do it early on, not last minute, as they will not read it. And they will read the chapters you submit to them. The important point is that they will only do it once for every chapter. Right? So you cannot keep submitting revised chapters to them because they will not. Right? Make sure you use that opportunity. Many students do, many students don't. It's always good to get feedback on your early drafts. So then, what you shouldn't expect, as I just said, you shouldn't expect them to be reading multiple drafts or chapters. In fact, they won't. They will not write the dissertation for you, which should be obvious. They will not proofread it. They will not correct your mistakes. More importantly, though, they will not nag you. They will not send you reminders and say, I haven't seen you in 5 weeks. I forgot how you look like. This is not what a dissertation supervisor will do. It's on you to schedule those meetings. It's on you to come prepared for them. Okay? So it's good practice. It's good to come with a question and say, this is my question about literature. This is what I would like to discuss today. It might be even good to send these issues in advance. Right? I scheduled to meet you next week at 12. I would like us to cover this topic. It's very helpful because it's a very efficient use of your supervision time with the supervisor. Okay, I'll leave this for the slides. Lastly, what's next? So today we talked about what dissertation is. Our next session will be on November 30th. I think the room is different, although I'm not sure. The rooms change, so make sure you check your timetables a few days before the class. I'll see you then, and we will talk about more specifically how to approach the different parts of dissertation. And then next term, this will be the second lecture this term, and the next term we'll have more of it. We'll have a number of workshops on methods, on ethics, on writing up, all sorts of things. I'll see you on the 30th. Thanks. Yes?
Thanks.
Did you just do that twice in a row?
Yep. It's not actually.
You sounded quite enthusiastic. We're still on lecture camp.
I know, that's what I'm saying. I was about to say soft drugs, but...
He's joking.
No. Yeah.